Welcome to Mr. and Mrs. Creeps. Tonight's story features a doctor of a small town as he returns from a long-deserved staycation to find the residents in chaos. Causing harm to themselves in fits of hallucination, the doctor is desperate to find the cause. All of his years of education and experience would not prepare him for the truth. Dr. Ernie Valbrandt had been practicing medicine for over 20 years. He started his career off with a drug manufacturer as an infectious control doctor monitoring patients in drug trials. Lots of paperwork and very long hours, but good money. He was able to quickly pay off his school loans. He fell in love with an amazing woman. He started a family and moved them to a small town. After what he saw at that lab, he wanted to be as isolated as he possibly could. His specialty now was family medicine 3 days a week and a hospital rotation twice a week. Between regular appointments, acute patients, and the rotations at the hospital, it was what a normal person would consider a mild work week in this small town. He got along well with his colleagues. He considered them to be very educated and dedicated to the health of their patients. They were the kind of doctors who would educate you and then gently guilt you into changing your eating habits and walking 10 minutes a day before prescribing medications for rising blood pressure or cholesterol or your sugar levels. On top of that, Sandy, Ernie's wife, cared so much about his patients that she would batch cook flavorful, healthy freezer meals and drop them off to the people who needed a little help getting started in the right direction. Their children were grown and had moved on to their own lives, but they stayed close to home. Everyone genuinely adored living there, even if it meant having to be more prepared and capable than the average American family, who tends to live in that just-in-time style of living that corporate America has created. It took well over an hour to get to the nearest grocery store. People had to plan and sharpen their skills to make sure they had food and firewood always on hand, not just in case of emergencies, but just to get through the week. Not many people were willing to live this way, so the town stayed small. There was a total of 3 doctors and 1 hospital designed to treat basic illness and traumas. Everyone knew one another. The center of town had a post office, town hall, library, a pizza shop. 1 street over was the fire hall, which also housed the 2 ambulances. And on the other side of town was the school, which was kindergarten through 12th grade, all in one building. No one revved their engines or gunned it down the road or did burnouts for fun. Mostly because if you broke your car, you had to fix it, and good luck getting parts in less than a week out there. Not to mention, the town policed itself. They never had any trouble. No one wanted to cause harm, and no one would allow someone to cause harm. It was quiet. It was serene. Just outside of town was the picturesque log cabin tucked away in the trees with a huge porch that Dr. Valbrandt and Sandy called home. This is where they were spending their staycation. They enjoyed the fresh air, the smell of pines, the sunshine, walks in the woods, and nights by the fireplace lost in books and each other. Heaven by some people's standards. But like all vacations, this one also had to come to an end. After his week-long staycation, Dr. Valbrandt headed back into town to open his office, which was located on the first floor of the hospital. He saw cars already in the parking lot, which was abnormal because he was an hour early. Normally, the parking lot was empty on that side of the building at this hour. He didn't even make it into the building before people started to approach him, begging him for help. After bringing everyone inside, he put 2 of the 3 patients and their family members in exam rooms and called his receptionist to let her know he was starting his day early. Peggy was a morning person, and she was chipper when she answered the phone. He could hear the smile in her voice as she sang the words, "Help is on the way." He was so thankful for her. His first patient suffered from a fever that set in the night before but was still very high. His second patient had a mild fever, and the muscles in her hands were starting to spasm and lock up. His third patient was also running a slight fever, and he said that sometimes he saw weird creatures out of the corner of his eyes, but when he blinked, they were gone. Dr. Valbrandt had no idea what could cause this sudden onset of signs and symptoms, but he didn't have time to think about it because it was non-stop all day. It was clear that whatever was happening, all the patients seemed to suffer from the same form of fever, muscle spasms, and hallucinations. At the end of his very long day, he met with the other 2 doctors and realized that collectively, they had seen 72 patients in the last 24 hours who complained of being ill. They talked about the need to report this to the Center for Disease, and they started the process. Exhausted, he rolled his window down on his drive home, trying to refresh his mind and body. Over the hum of the engine, he heard a woman screaming for help. He parked his car in the driveway of a familiar, dingy white farmhouse and made his way inside. His eyes scanned back and forth while hearing a commotion in the kitchen. He cautiously made his way deeper into the house and saw Carl, a man he knew, sitting at the kitchen table, ripping off his fingernails and muttering in a whisper, "You can't make me. You can't make me. I won't let you. You can't make me," over and over again. Dr. Valbrandt always had his old-school doctor's bag and pulled out a sedative and administered it to Carl. He called for an ambulance and then began asking Carl's wife what happened. She said he hadn't been feeling well and that he was running a fever. He took a cold shower. He had gone to bed after he had some soup. He slept all day. She finally went outside to get the laundry off the clothesline, which she had left out there the day before because of all the commotion. And when she came back in, this is what she found him doing. The doctor sat there, desperately trying to connect the dots on what could be causing this widespread kind of behavior as the ambulance arrived. As a medical practitioner, it is improper to turn a patient over to someone with less experience than you, so not only was he obligated to ride in the ambulance, he truly cared and didn't want to leave Carl's side after seeing him in that altered state. Once at the hospital, the gravity of the situation became heavier. The few emergency rooms they had were filled, and the beds set up in the hallways were overflowing like a messed up game of Tetris. The only things that helped calm the situation were fluids and sedatives. Samples were being collected from each patient, but they needed to be sent off for processing, so until then, all Dr. Valbrandt and his colleagues could do was keep everyone comfortable and sedated to prevent them from continuing to hurt themselves or worse, somebody else. That course of action all changed when John, one of the first patients to present with this mysterious illness, jumped up out of bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. The nursing staff rushed into John's room to find him punching in the air and screaming in pure terror. The 3 nurses attempted to calm him down, but he swung wildly at them, calling them evil and telling them to stay away. Then suddenly, he bolted to the window, yanked it open, and pushed out the screen and launched himself out of the 3rd-story window. The nursing staff watched in horror, and when they looked down, they saw John bounce back up and run off into the dark. The room fell silent. How can a man sedated with a tranquilizer have a burst of energy to do what John had done? Dr. Valbrandt was at a loss and completely drained at this point. He needed food and he needed his medical books. On his way to one of the offices where he kept his books and a mini fridge stocked with emergency supply of protein bars, Dr. Valbrandt saw a man dressed in a white suit come out of one of the patient rooms. He didn't recognize him, but he hoped that he would stay there so he could ask if he had any information that might be helpful. The man made eye contact with him briefly, turned in the other direction, and walked down the hall. Dr. Valbrandt hurried into the room. His patient, a young woman, was lying there motionless. The cables that connected her to the machines that read her vital signs were now swinging below them. He rushed over and checked, but could not find a pulse. He yelled for help, and the nurses, who were still in shock over watching John jump out of the window, rushed in. They started CPR, and by this time his colleague, Dr. Bernstein, had shown up and stepped in as primary. Dr. Valbrandt told one of the nurses to call the police and have them look for a man in a white suit, confident that he had something to do with this mess, and fled the room after him. He ran so fast down the corridors that the motion lights were slow to turn on, leaving him with dim lighting from hallway to hallway. He heard the door close, which led to a flight of stairs at the roof slam shut. He wasn't thinking at this point. He was already low on reserves and acting purely on instinct as he floated up the stairs, 2 at a time. He caught up to the man in the suit. The man was calmly standing by the edge of the building, like he was waiting for him. Dr. Valbrandt, through heavy gulps of air, demanded to know who he was. He smiled and said, "Come on, Ernie. You know who I am." Dr. Valbrandt was confused. He just stood there, nothing going through his mind, just staring into the dark eyes of this person in front of him. The man in the suit pressed on. "Where are you, Ernie?" A shiver went down Dr. Valbrandt's spine. He felt dizzy and a little nervous. He took a step back to create some distance between himself and the unknown assailant, but it was too late. The man pulled out a canister from his pocket and sprayed Dr. Valbrandt in the face, causing him to lose his footing and plunge over the roof edge to the sidewalk below. As he fell, he thought about his wife and his kids and couldn't believe that this is how his life would come to an end. Ernie could hear the beeping sounds of a hospital room. He slowly opened his eyes. Sitting to his right was a woman in a physician's coat who looked very much like his wife, Sandy. She introduced herself as Dr. Rose, and to her left was a man who introduced himself as Dr. White. Ernie's pulse was starting to race. He didn't understand what was happening and why he wasn't dead. Or maybe he was. He stared quietly at Dr. Rose, studying the features of her face. When she finally spoke, it was like a crushing heaviness filled him. Ernie had imagined everything. He was not a doctor. Sandy was not his wife. There was never a mysterious contagion. He was suffering a psychotic break. The chase up to the roof and the shock of his death was a technique used by Dr. White to shock him back into reality. This reality. Ernie felt all his emotions all at once, and he just stared. Finally, he asked, "How long have I been here?" 8 months. 8 months of his life gone. His body was sore and he felt shaky. It took an entire week before he began to get stronger as he was able to move more and he became more lucid. With the help of Dr. Rose, he remembered the loss of his family while staying at their mountain home as the moment his world fractured. A tragic accident when the generator exhaust filled the rooms while they slept. Ernie couldn't remember why he wasn't there that night, but Dr. Rose assured him that that would come with time and to be patient. He thought he should feel some deeper form of grief or sadness, but he felt numb. Perhaps this was a coping mechanism. Another month went by, talking daily with Dr. Rose about who he really was and what his life was like, and he began to feel okay. He was shocked that anything like this could have ever happened to him, and he was a little ashamed. Finally, the day came for him to be discharged. He was scared, but he was ready to leave. The first place he went was back up to the cabin to confront that darkness that hid inside him. It was a long drive alone with his thoughts and self-doubt. Finally arriving, as he gazed upon the big house, it looked comforting to him. But as he walked over the threshold of the now vacant house, he wasn't sure if he could continue forward. He took a deep breath and made his way into the living room and sat on the worn-in sofa and pulled out a box of photos. He saw his beautiful wife, Lisa, and their 2 children, and he sobbed uncontrollably. The guilt was so overwhelming that he had to lie down before he passed out. And he turned his head and looked across the room at all the memories that were coming back. And he noticed an envelope just under a bookcase. It stood out because, while everything was coated in dust, the house was well organized, and this was out of place. Leaving the sofa seemed like an insurmountable task, but his curiosity drove him. After picking it up, he noticed that it looked as if it was just placed there. There was no envelope-shaped void in the dust on the floor, or any dust on the outside. Walking back to the sofa, he looked it over. It was just a plain white envelope that had the flap tucked inside. As he held it in his hands, he was trying to place the memory of it. He carefully opened it, revealing a handwritten note that read, "They lied to you. You are not crazy. Don't let them know you know, or they will kill you." Ernie's eyes floated to the top of the paper. There, he found a logo for a drug manufacturer where Dr. Valbrandt worked as an infectious control doctor monitoring patients in drug trials. The drug manufacturer that shouldn't exist. Thank you for listening. Good night. Sleep tight under starry skies till morning light.